And thank you again. Thank you all for sticking around until the end of what I know is a very long day. It's to be honest, it's a hard presentation to follow. It was so powerful and meaningful. And since we're talking about teams, I think I'll just leave it enough to say that if I were in charge of forming a high-performance team, I would hope that I would have somebody as insightful and thoughtful as our last speaker on it. And I'm sure you feel the same way. Now, it is the end of the day. It is a long day. Don't think of me as the person between you and the bar, even though that's more or less what I am. Think of me as a final aperitif that you can munch on right before we head out. And we have seen this very difficult day that Luke has had come full circle now, all the way around to the team that is going to be looking after this patient in the hospital. And I come from a background in emergency medicine and trauma, so that's the perspective I'm going to be speaking from. But of course, these team skills apply to a variety of scenarios, be that pre-hospital, emergency department, ICU, OR, and beyond. Now, I'm afraid I need to make Lucas's day a little bit worse because a fall down a staircase is a little bit pedestrian for my purposes. Unless you're talking about the staircase at the back of the theater. I don't know if anyone has tried to go down that thing. It's a nightmare. It's like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. It just needs spikes or something to make it slightly more lethal to walk down. But we'll say that Luke, and I would agree with Mark from this morning as well, that Luke in my part of the world, I'm from Toronto, Luke is not the name of an old person. It's the name of a skinny young hipster with a prominent larynx and a stinky t-shirt who's walking around town looking for weed. That's the Lucas that I know. And so this is the Lucas that we'll be discussing, but Lucas didn't fall down the steps. Lucas regrettably fell 6 stories out of a building onto the ground, and he comes to your hospital as a major trauma activation. And if you're paying attention to traumatology, you'll know that 6 stories is above the LD50 of falls from height. In other words, more than half the people who fall that distance are going to die. And from the get-go, things are not going so well. This patient shows up without any IVs, without having been intubated, wildly agitated, flailing on the resuscitation table. There is no measurable blood pressure. There is barely a central pulse. The team leader from the outset is a little bit agitated, recognizes that this is a sick patient, snaps at the anesthesia team at the head of the table and says, "I want this patient intubated now." And the anesthesia team recognizes that we should probably resuscitate a little bit first. And 30 seconds later, the team leader says, "Why hasn't this patient been resuscitated yet?" So that's immediately off to somewhat of a bad start. The nurses, understandably, are trying to get IV access, but they're being knuckled out of the way by a bit of an ultrasound wanker who's looking for gallstones in the right upper quadrant. Something strange and irrelevant like that. There's a bit of a back and forth going within the team. Nobody really has a clear sense of priorities just yet, and so everyone is kind of filling in their own story and their own sense of priorities. And in the clamor, and as members of the team sort of trickle in one by one, sign-over doesn't go too terribly well. And much of the information from the EMS team is missed, including the fact that they are trying to communicate that this patient may have taken an overdose before he jumped off of a building. Does any of this sound at all familiar? Worrisomely familiar when we reflect on our practice. Any team, but particularly ad hoc teams that come together spontaneously, have to go through a process of assembly, orientation, co-orientation, action, and recovery. They do this to different degrees and with different skills involved. And as Tom may have put it, the mayonnaise in this, the complex element of it, is the process of co-orientation. Because your teams are going to assemble, they're going to get together to do what they have to do, and they're going to take an appraisal of that situation and develop their own orientation, their own mental model. But then the question of whether or not they co-orient, whether or not they can form a shared mental model of team and task-based processes requires the application of specific tools and specific skills. High-performing teams do this, but they only do it because they've practiced these skills and have gotten good at it. These things don't happen spontaneously, they don't occur in a vacuum, and just like anything else in medicine, they require practice and repetition in order to become effective. If you look at the literature on high-performance teams, over and over and over again, a consistent characteristic is the notion of implicit coordination, that good teams, during periods of high task load and high decision overhead, can switch from a verbal, discussion-based, discourse-based method of operation, which is timely and expensive from a cognitive point of view, it's expensive real estate, to an implicit mode of communication. And what does that mean? That means that team members have an understanding of team and task-based processes that need to happen in order to get the task done. They have an understanding, and more importantly, they have a shared understanding. So they understand what their role is, they understand the capacities of the other team members around them, and they understand the greater priorities that the team has to accomplish as a unit. If you think about Tom's example early on, about the field hockey player that made the pass up the field, well, that's training and that's practice and that's repetition and coaching, and it's all of those things, but it's also understanding that that player has a certain speed and a certain capability and a certain handedness of shot. They have a mental model of what's required both from the team and from the task at hand in order to be able to accomplish it. And that's implicit coordination. And if you want to drill down to the sort of very fundamental nature of high-performance teams, it's the ability to switch into that mode of implicit coordination when the situation calls for it. And so what I'd like to do then is talk about 4 or 5 very specific tools that can help you do that. From the 0-point survey all the way down to the end of the resuscitation and modes of recovery that can help your team process and get better and prepare for the next time. The first that I want to talk about is the pre-brief. And I think from my perspective, this is absolutely one of the most important things that you can do with your team before a patient arrives. It doesn't have to take long. A pre-brief can be 20 seconds, it can be 2 minutes, but it has to be done. My perspective is that when team members arrive for a scenario like this and they get a little muttering of, oh, it was a patient that fell from height, okay, people are pretty good at going into their own heads and they start to get their discipline-specific things ready. If it's airway, they're setting it for airway. If it's getting IV access, they're doing that. But there is often very little communication between team members about what the team is meant to do together. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but from my perspective, there is an absolute world of difference between a team that walks into a cardiac arrest having been briefed versus a team that just sort of hits that face first and has to decide on the fly who's doing what and what the rules are and what the priorities are. Now, there's a world of difference between those teams. And where I see it the most is in trauma cardiac arrest, where a lot of interventions have to happen very quickly in a very specific order and requires a lot of coordination. If you just let that happen to your team, then typically chaos and confusion ensues, whereas a briefing can circumvent some of that. And I can think of a trauma arrest that we had fairly recently where we had maybe 30 seconds at the most to pre-brief and prepare. And I looked at the team. For about 30 seconds before the patient arrived, there was this quiet calm in the room. Nobody was really saying anything. Everyone was kind of prepared, had a shared understanding of what was going to happen. They reminded me very much of a sprinter on a line. They were coiled, they were ready, they were positioned, and then they were just ready to go. There was no agitation, there was no confusion, there was no nervous energy. It was all very contained and controlled energy. And I think that's what a good briefing does, is it gets everyone on that line and prepared to jump if they have to. There are a variety of paradigms to make this happen. I wouldn't pretend that this is the only script, but I think good briefing scripts cover several fundamental questions. The first is, what do we know? And so for a trauma patient like this, what do we know? It can be very simple. A briefing for this patient might have simply included, we have a young male who fell from height, who's comatose and hypotensive. That's what we know. The next question is, how are we going to respond? What are we going to do? What are our initial interventions going to be? And I agree with what Tom said earlier, that you can't plan your mental model out too far into the process. Your goal in a briefing like this should be to plan the first 5 to 10 minutes, maybe, before your predictive value basically falls apart. And so what is our initial response going to be? What are our initial interventions going to be for a hypotensive patient with a fall? And then importantly, what are our contingencies? What are we going to do if that doesn't work? I think we're pretty good at discussing contingencies when it comes to airway. We often talk about our airway plan A and our plan B and our plan C, but we don't do that with a lot of resuscitation interventions. So let's say we give a volume challenge to this patient and they don't respond. What does that mean? What are we going to do differently? And then finally, what are our roles? Who's going to do what? So what do we know? What are we going to do initially? What's our backup plan? And then who's going to do what? And really, that should carry you no further than the first 5 or 10 minutes into a resuscitation, but it gets everyone on that shared line so that they can move forward with some cohesion. Now, Cliff Reed coined this concept of the 0-point survey, and then a few of us got together and workshopped this idea and produced a paper on it, which you can look for. There was a lot of argument about whether it should be called the 0-point survey at all. Some people named Hicks thought it should be called the 0.0 survey. The 0-point survey sounds a little bit like it has no point, or it has 0 points in it. It's neither of those things. The 0-point survey is based on the premise that the care of your patient doesn't start with the primary survey. It starts before that. And anyone here who's in pre-hospital medicine I'm telling you something you already know, which is scene safety, environmental safety, self-preparation, equipment preparation should all precede the primary survey. And the concept of a zero-point survey is there's a series of elements that needs to happen before you ever encounter the patient and before you take on the primary survey that will make that initial patient encounter much more successful. And this is basically how the zero-point survey breaks down. I think it's important to recognize that the first three elements of this STEP-UP acronym have nothing at all to do with direct patient care. They happen before the patient arrives. That psychological preparation of, are you in the right mindset? Are you hungry? Do you have to pee? I do disagree with Tom. I love to pass out bananas in my trauma room. If people are looking a little peakish, everyone gets a banana. I don't have a problem with that. What's your state of psychological preparation? Has the team been briefed? And then, and very importantly, what does your environmental scan look like? Is your environment safe? Do you have what you need? Do you have the equipment that you need? And again, to pre-hospital providers, this is not news. But my observation with in-hospital resuscitation is we do a very lousy job of this, particularly when we think about environmental control and environmental safety. Those aren't elements we're used to looking at. I think it's because we plan so hard for the primary survey, we forget that there is a whole series of things that needs to happen pre-primary survey as part of the zero-point survey. How many people have a mechanism for writing down sign-over when it happens? I mean, like writing it down for the room to see. A few? We did this in our trauma room, and we do it now mostly because it got to really annoy me when EMS would do sign over, and then people would trickle in one by one and say, hey man, what happened? What's the story? And it would continually interrupt. And of course, as we know, as handover gets repeated and repeated, there's information degradation that falls apart. And with time, that transient drop in blood pressure that happened in the field gets dropped from the sign over because it's been repeated enough times that you lose the signal. So a very simple thing that we did was put a whiteboard in our trauma room. And as the patient walks in and the sign-over is provided, it gets written on the board. And then when somebody comes to me to say, hey, sorry, I missed sign-over, what happened? You just point to the board. And of course, this is a nice way to get a clear mental model to the team so that even in the middle of a chaotic situation, people are, in our trauma room, at least just used to looking over at that very low-tech intervention and getting a sense of what's happening in an instant. And that's been very helpful for us in terms of onboarding team members when the startup is somewhat asynchronous. So now we've gone from pre-briefing and primary survey to the structure of your team itself. And this concept of emergence or emergent organization can help you structure your team to respond to uncertainty and complexity. So what's emergence? Emergence is a complex idea in and of itself. Essentially what it refers to is how individual simplicity can translate into organized complexity, how very individual simplistic units can get together to form very complex response units. And emergence phenomenon, it's actually studied a fair bit in business. Big companies trying to figure out how to keep up with enormous complexity when their companies are operating on a global scale and in real time. But it's felt to underpin everything from how neurons get together to form intelligence, to mob behavior, to how starlings flock in the sky. And as you can appreciate from this picture, there's this remarkable complexity of movement that occurs when starlings flock by the hundreds of thousands that far exceeds the complexity of any individual member of that group. I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with a starling, but they're no neurosurgeons. And these birds are just simply responding to a few very simple and consistent rules that allow them to flock in this very complex pattern. Individual simplicity creating organized complexity. And I think this has implications for how you set up your team to respond to a complex resuscitation. So this is what we would call a standard functional team setup. This is what a trauma team in my shop might look like. You've had a team leader at the top and a bunch of team members working under that person at the bottom. And of course, as decision overhead goes up and complexity goes up, there's all this information being fed back to the team leader who then has to coordinate somewhat directly the decisions of each member of that team. And that can be a real challenge, it can be a real cognitive load. Whereas, during periods of high task load and high decision overhead, to me it makes a lot of sense to reorganize your team under more functional lines. And a functional team looks like this. This is essentially mini teams or sub-teams. These are semi-autonomous units that are empowered to act on their own towards a specific and measurable objective in the resuscitation. And this would look different for every scenario, but in a case like this, you may identify an airway team, come up with a shared plan about what the intubation strategy is going to be, and then off they go and do that. And do the same thing for somebody who's attaching a pelvic binder, doing the same thing for somebody who's managing thoracic trauma. And again, when you do this as team leader, your role is to foster the environment in which these teams can function semi-autonomously without trying to over-manufacture or micromanage the scenario. In a sense, it offloads you cognitively as team leader to be able to think a bit more broadly about the scenario. Because it's true, it's very hard to share a mental model across a very large team. So why try? It actually makes a lot of sense from a cognitive point of view to shrink people's worlds a little bit and say, for the next 15 minutes, this is your world. You're working on chest trauma, and that's all you have to focus on. And that way the mental model constraint becomes a little bit more easier to manage. I don't know if you've noticed, but the lettering in this presentation looks kind of weird. I didn't share my mental model with you, and I did that on purpose. The only letters that get capitalized in this talk are the letters in team. And if you're an OCD person like myself, and that was just irritating you, enjoy how much easier the rest of the slides are going to be to look at now that I've shared my mental model of slide design with you. So a mental model only gets you so far. And as we talked about, a briefing might get you 5 or 10 minutes into a resuscitation, but then the scenario is dynamic enough that things start to change. And this is where you need to take a pause, a breath, a reset. This is where a two-way conversation needs to happen between team leader and team members to get a better sense of where you are and where you are going to move next. And I think that's the key. I think these conversations really need to be two-way conversations between members and leaders. Because if you don't provide team members with a forum to speak up with a concern that they might have, the amazing thing is they might walk out of that room, much like you heard with the prior airway case, knowing something is the matter, but not feeling like they had the opportunity to speak up about it. One scenario that comes to mind in our trauma room, I forget with shocking frequency to give tranexamic acid in bleeding patients. It's just something I can't remember. I don't know why. We have a giant sign on our wall that says, bleeding less than 3 hours, give tranexamic acid. But it's one of those things that I just, for whatever reason, I forget. And we've actually put it on a checklist, and life's gotten a little bit easier. But what's remarkable to me is we may leave that trauma room without giving TXA to a bleeding patient. And somebody in that room knew that. They recognized it, they noticed that it was absent, and they didn't speak up on it. It's not their fault. The reason they didn't speak up on it is because I didn't provide them with the opportunity as team leader to do so. So people will carry things out of the trauma room or the resuscitation room that they know in their head are wrong because you haven't given them the opportunity to speak up about it. Now, you've already heard a little bit about this. There are a variety of ways to structure that tactical pause. The 10 for 10 is a nice one because it gives you a recap. It tells you what's happening now. It talks about agreed upon next steps and priorities, and then you allocate roles specifically. So for a case like this, it might be something simply like, okay, now we have IV access. We've decompressed the chest. We've put a pelvic binder on. We started to give blood. Now we're in a position to intubate. Here's the plan for that, and then our next steps are going to be the following. But again, I do think that is really important that this needs to be a two-way conversation, not just a conversation with yourself in an echo chamber. And I even think the language here is important to nuance, because if you simply say, anyone else have anything to suggest? Very often people won't say anything. A phrase that I really like to use is, what am I missing? Because it implies that I'm missing something, and it gives your team members permission to recognize that you've left something out or to speak up about a concern. And so that pause needs to be two things, not just a recap, but to make sure there's some dialogue back and forth between team leader and team member about anticipated next steps. Now, things will get chaotic. You think about mass casualty scenes, there is no way to contain that chaos, but you can give chaos only a few specific pathways to move down so that you have predictive ability even in the most chaotic and uncontrollable of situations. And this is what high-performance teams manage to do. This is in the safety literature, it's referred to as preferred error. In other words, if your team is going to fail or your task is going to fail, it's going to fail down 2 or 3 preferred channels that you can somewhat predict, as opposed to going off in some random direction that you can't predict. And you can engineer preferred failure by way of team dynamics. Basically what you're saying is, how do you get in a resuscitation from process A to process B without going all over the place in the middle? A good example of this is take a technical procedure that you might do in a resuscitation. My advice would be the next time you're at work, go through that process from start to finish and not just see if you can talk through it. You may say, I'm going to insert a Blakemore tube in a patient with massive upper GI bleeding if the following things don't work, but can you actually do that? Do you know where the tube is for the starting point? For us, for the longest time, you couldn't find a Blakemore tube or a Linton tube in our hospital, no matter what. So you could talk about it all you wanted, but nobody could ever find it. Do you know where all the ports lead to? Do you know how to connect it? Do you know how to verify that it's positioning? Do your team members understand that? And do you as the doctor get when to use it, and do the nurses understand why you're using it and what their role is in that scenario? That is a way in which you can eliminate that uncertainty and constrain that chaos so that when you have to do it in the real moment, it's not hitting you in the face. You've actually practiced it and planned it a little bit. Now, we've created some logistic tools to help us with this. There really is no substitute for doing this in advance. These are not things that you can typically do on the fly. You can take the world's most high-performance team, and if you hide all of their tools from them, it's going to be very hard for them to perform. We just built a very large and cumbersome emergency department. We realized we needed some way to get resuscitation equipment to the bedside, so we created these resus towers. It's a bit hard to appreciate in this picture, but this is about a 6-foot-tall tower, and it's not just for doctors. The top level is airway and RT equipment. The middle stuff is, broadly speaking, doctor stuff like femoral art lines, radial art lines, central art lines. The middle stuff is kind of in the middle, and there's some nursing equipment, and then down below it's rarer procedures like a pericardiocentesis, a Blakemore tube, and a few other things. And this has been incredibly helpful for us in empowering resuscitation logistics. If you open up these drawers, you get all these completely delicious little bundles that have labels on them that match the color of the drawers. So everything you need for that given procedure, which is identified on the outside of the drawer, is contained for you in that bundle. Again, my OCD nature is showing through here because I love how consistent all of this is. And then what we do with this tower is park it outside the room where we're doing a resuscitation. And it becomes a very clear beacon for something is up. And it's great for resuscitation rubberneckers as well. Because if you don't want to go and see that patient who's had belly pain for 14 years, you look down the hall and you see a resus tower and you go, well, something's up. I can go and rubberneck there instead. So these have greatly empowered our ability to exercise resuscitation logistics and constrain some of that chaos that would otherwise take precedence in a difficult scenario. And then finally, teams need to recover. So you work your way through a difficult resuscitation. We already heard about how difficult and challenging something like that can be to bounce back from. Never mind when things go well, but in particular when things go wrong. How many people here make a regular habit in their hospital or wherever, their pre-hospital environment, wherever, of debriefing live clinical events? It's a bit hard to see, but that's a smattering, I would say. Now that's a number I think that we all need to get better at. And oh, too late. That's a number that we need to improve upon. We're not that good either, but we're working towards a process where we debrief all live clinical resuscitation events. And I think this is incredibly important from team dynamics, for psychological safety of team members, and for process improvement. If we can't get that structured learning from a clinical event, then so much is lost. And it also kind of breeds a toxic culture in your resuscitation team, because if something is up, let's say there was a disagreement, interpersonal challenge, something like that, something you didn't agree with, if you don't get it out there and talk about it, it festers and it becomes toxic and it becomes poison. And this is that sort of toxic passive-aggressive culture that we know is so lethal to the functioning of high-performance teams. You need to get that out there. You need a forum by which team members can discuss that. And I think that the post-debrief, whether that's a hot debrief, which happens immediately afterwards, or a cold debrief, which happens later on, both of those things are incredibly important to really understanding what happened in a resuscitation scenario. But I wouldn't stop there. Once you've debriefed a scenario, I think you need to train on it. And you've already heard a fair bit today about training and education, and in particular simulation for resuscitation training. What we tend to do at our shop when we debrief an event, if we think it's relevant enough, is we construct a simulation out of it. And then we run those simulations in an in situ environment again and again and again. We call them a living M&M. Because it's great to talk about it, but if you have a case like that that generates enough discussion, why not make it into a training exercise? And this is incredible for team member engagement. It's incredible for process improvement. It's a wonderful way to get people's concerns on the table and then to engineer your environment to make your resuscitation environment better too. So the living M&M has become a fairly consistent process for us, superseding, I would say, what we would consider a traditional sort of rounds-based M&M model. All right, so let's get back to our patient. Pretty banged up, but you got your lines, you got your tubes, things are starting to roll now. Let's run back over some of the things that we did to facilitate that team performance. Well, the first was a 0-point survey. We started before the patient ever got there. We looked at the environment, we played the trauma game. Fall from height, 6 stories, what sort of injuries do we predict? Easy, okay, well, based on those injuries, what equipment are we gonna have ready? Pelvic binder on the table, blood primed and ready, airway equipment ready to go. a massive transfusion activated before the patient ever arrived at the hospital. Simply predicting injuries gave us some ability to brief and then do an environmental scan to make sure that what we had anticipated is what we were setting up for. We then ran through this 4-point pre-briefing. What do we know? What are we going to do as an initial response? What's our backup behavior and what's our supportive behavior going to be if that's wrong or it doesn't work? And then who's going to do what? And that helped us to not run face first into the resuscitation, but have a little bit of poise and control at the start. And then it became very clear after a while that this patient had a lot of complex multi-system injuries, so we broke the team down into sub-teams, into these mini-teams, these semi-autonomous units that worked fairly independently for constrained periods of the resuscitation on airway, on thoracic injury, on vascular access, and so on. Certain distance in, of course, it became challenging to really predict what things are going to look like moving forward. So we had this very structured snap brief or situation report happening every 10 minutes or so, the so-called 10 for 10. And then finally, this was a challenging case for everybody, so we talked about it. We did a hot debrief, which focused a bit more on psychological safety and how the team members were doing. And then we had a cold debrief several weeks later where we looked at a few more systems-based issues. For example, this is a patient that ended up needing interventional radiology for embolization of a pelvic fracture. But this was 10 o'clock at night, and at our hospital, our angio team is at home. So that creates a lot of logistics and challenges and delays in care for getting that embo team into the hospital when we need them. And so a discussion like that can lead to system-based changes that make the care of the next patient that shows up with those injuries even better. And that stemmed from the cold debrief. And all of those things together, I think, in my humble opinion, help to make your resuscitation teams excellent. But I would, of course, love to hear what you think as well. So you have the ResusNL app, you have the Twitter machine. Please shout at me on that. And I will see you at the bar. Thank you very much.